If you're enjoying stories of justice and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more captivating narratives like this one. Now, let's dive into the tale of a woman who was underestimated one too many times. The rain fell in heavy sheets across the cemetery, umbrellas blooming like black flowers over the mourners. Alberta Williams stood closest to the freshly dug grave, her 64-year-old frame looking suddenly frail beneath her dark coat. Her eyes, however, remained dry. She had shed all her tears in private during the 3 months she'd watched cancer slowly claim her husband of 38 years. "We should wrap this up," a voice hissed behind her. "This weather is dreadful." Alberta didn't need to turn to recognize Cynthia's voice, her stepson, Edward's wife, and self-appointed spokesperson for the family. The woman had barely spoken 10 words to Richard while he was alive, but had suddenly become exceptionally concerned with funeral arrangements once he passed. "Just a few more minutes," Alberta replied softly, her gaze fixed on the mahogany casket being lowered into the ground. Her wedding ring glinted dully in the grey light as she clutched a single white rose. "We have the reception to get to," Cynthia pressed, stepping forward in her designer boots that were now speckled with mud. "People are waiting. Important people." Alberta nodded absently, the words washing over her like the rain. What Cynthia meant was that there were people she wanted to impress, corporate acquaintances of Richard's she hoped might offer her husband opportunities now that the patriarch was gone. People who, Alberta knew, had never particularly respected Richard in the first place. As the last of the dirt was placed on the grave, the small gathering began to disperse. Alberta felt a hand on her elbow, not gentle but insistent. "The car is waiting," Edward said, his voice carrying the same brisk efficiency of his father, but none of the warmth. At 42, he had Richard's height and build, but his features were harder, shaped by ambition rather than experience. In the limousine, Alberta sat silently between Edward and his sister, Marianne. The siblings spoke across her as if she weren't there, discussing the house, the accounts, what would need to be sorted out. "You don't need to worry about any of that," Marianne told Alberta suddenly, patting her hand with artificial sweetness. "We'll take care of everything." "That's very kind," Alberta replied, her slight southern accent more pronounced in her exhaustion. "But I'm sure I'll manage." Marianne exchanged a glance with her brother that Alberta caught in her peripheral vision, a look that said, "Poor thing, she has no idea." The reception was held at Alberta and Richard's home, a beautiful colonial revival on 2 acres in Fairfield County. As Alberta stepped through her own front door, she found herself being guided not to the center of the gathering as the widow, but to a quiet corner where she would be less conspicuous. "Why don't you rest here, Alberta?" Cynthia suggested, though it wasn't really a suggestion. "You must be exhausted. I'll make sure everyone is taken care of." Alberta watched as Cynthia swept away in her black designer dress, already playing hostess in a home she'd visited perhaps 5 times in the last decade. Around the room, she spotted Richard's cousins, his business associates, his college friends, people Alberta had cooked for, entertained, and built relationships with over nearly 4 decades of marriage. Yet somehow, within hours of Richard's burial, she had been relegated to the role of elderly accessory. "Mrs. Williams?" A discreet voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Daniel Pierce, Richard's longtime attorney, standing beside her chair. His kind eyes held something she recognized immediately: concern. "Daniel," she said, her voice warming slightly, "thank you for coming." "Of course," he replied quietly, taking the seat beside her. "How are you holding up?" Before she could answer, Edward approached, champagne flute in hand. "Pierce?" He acknowledged the lawyer with a curt nod. "I was hoping to speak with you about Dad's affairs. When would be a good time to review the estate?" Daniel's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I think perhaps we should discuss that after the appropriate mourning period, don't you? And naturally, with Alberta present." Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. But there are pressing matters. The company needs direction. And we need to sort out living arrangements. Living arrangements? Alberta asked, looking up at her stepson. Just practical considerations, Edward replied smoothly. This house is much too large for one person, especially at your age. We thought perhaps something smaller, more manageable would be appropriate. Daniel's eyebrows rose, but before he could speak, Cynthia appeared with an elderly gentleman in tow. Alberta, you remember Mr. Hoffman from the garden club, she said loudly, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. He was just saying how lovely your hydrangeas are looking this year. As Alberta was pulled into conversation, Daniel gave her a meaningful look that said, "We'll speak later." She nodded slightly, the first stirrings of something beyond grief beginning to take root in her chest. The evening progressed, and Alberta observed with quiet attention as Cynthia led guests on tours of the family home, as Edward discussed taking over the family business with Richard's colleagues, and as Marianne examined the silver and artwork with appraising eyes. By the time the last guest had departed, Alberta felt a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the realization that was crystallizing before her. They were going to try to push her out. Alberta, Marianne said, approaching with a glass of water and what appeared to be medication. I've prepared your bedroom. You must be exhausted. Alberta looked at the pills in confusion. What are these? Just something to help you sleep, Marianne replied. I found them in your medicine cabinet. Edward and I thought it would be best if we stayed here for a while to help you adjust. I've set up in the blue room, and Edward and Cynthia will take the guest suite. Alberta placed the glass down carefully. That's very thoughtful but unnecessary. I'll be fine on my own. Cynthia joined them, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors that Alberta had carefully selected 20 years ago. Alberta, we insist. This is a family matter, and we need to stick together now. Family matter, Alberta repeated softly. It was the first time in 38 years that Cynthia had used the word family to include her. We've been talking, Edward said, entering the room with a tumbler of Richard's expensive scotch. And we think it might be best if you considered moving to Sunny Pines. The retirement community? Alberta asked, her voice steady despite the shock. It's very nice, Marianne added quickly. Margaret's mother loves it there, and they have nurses on staff, which would be a relief for all of us, considering your health. My health is excellent, Alberta said. For now, Cynthia interjected, but at your age, one never knows, and this house requires so much upkeep. I've managed it for 30 years, Alberta pointed out. Edward sighed, taking a seat across from her. Alberta, let's be practical. Dad took care of everything, the finances, the property management, the investments. You've never had to worry about those things. Now that he's gone, it makes sense to simplify your life, and frankly, this house should stay in the family. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Alberta was not really family. She was an appendage, a temporary attachment to Richard that had now served its purpose. I see, she said finally, rising from her chair with dignity. Well, it's been a long day. I think I will retire now. We can discuss this further in the morning. As she climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, the room she had shared with Richard for decades, Alberta felt a strange calm settling over her. By the time she closed the door behind her, the tears that had refused to come at the cemetery were flowing freely. But alongside the grief was something else. Resolution. She picked up the phone on her nightstand and dialed a number she knew by heart. Daniel, it's Alberta. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need your help. And I need a room at the Madison Hotel for tomorrow night. Yes, I think it's time. Morning light filtered through the curtains of the master bedroom as Alberta methodically packed a small suitcase. She selected items with care: comfortable clothing, essential toiletries, and a few photographs, including one of her and Richard on their 30th anniversary trip to Greece. She slipped her hand beneath the mattress and retrieved a small leather portfolio containing documents that Richard had insisted she keep separate from their other papers. "Always be prepared, Bertie," he had told her, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "People see what they want to see, and sometimes that works in our favor." Downstairs she could hear movement, the casual confidence of people who believed they were already home. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs, along with the murmur of conversation that halted abruptly when she descended. "Good morning," Alberta said pleasantly, setting her suitcase by the door. 3 pairs of eyes tracked from her face to the luggage and back again. "Going somewhere?" Edward asked, a note of surprise in his voice. "Yes," Alberta replied simply. "I've decided to take your advice and give myself some space to grieve properly. I'll be staying at the Madison for a few days." Cynthia nearly choked on her coffee. "The Madison? Alberta, that's hardly necessary. That place is $300 a night at least." $350 for the standard rooms," Alberta corrected mildly. "More for the suites." "Which is precisely why it makes no sense," Edward interjected. "Dad's accounts are frozen until the will is executed. You should be careful with whatever personal savings you have." Alberta smiled faintly. "I appreciate your concern. We're just looking out for you," Marianne added, her tone conciliatory. "If you need space, why not stay with one of your friends? Or I could drive you to Sunny Pines today. They often have short-term accommodations available." "The Madison will be fine," Alberta said, picking up her handbag. "Daniel is picking me up in about 20 minutes. I trust you'll all be comfortable here while I'm gone." A look passed between the 3 of them. Relief poorly disguised as concern. "Of course," Cynthia said quickly. "Take all the time you need. We'll look after everything." "I'm sure you will," Alberta replied, her tone neutral. "Oh, and Cynthia, the thermostats are a bit tricky in this house. The one in the living room runs about 4 degrees hot, so you'll want to set it lower than you think." Cynthia blinked, caught off guard by the mundane advice. "Oh, thank you. And the shower in the guest bathroom needs a specific touch to get the hot water flowing properly. Edward knows. He's stayed here often enough." Edward shifted uncomfortably. The last time he'd stayed overnight in this house had been 7 years ago, and it had ended with a tense argument between him and his father about his business practices. "I'm sure we'll figure it out," he said dismissively. Alberta nodded. "I'm sure you will. The gardener comes on Tuesdays and the housekeeper on Thursdays. Their contact information is in my desk drawer if you need it." As she spoke, she moved toward the sideboard where a row of framed photographs stood. She picked up one of Richard in his Navy uniform, taken years before she met him, and tucked it carefully into her handbag. "That's Dad's," Marianne said sharply. Alberta looked at her steadily. "Yes, it is, and he's my husband." The doorbell rang before Marianne could respond. Daniel Pierce stood on the doorstep, his expression neutral as he greeted the family and collected Alberta's suitcase. "I've taken the liberty of making a reservation for you at the Madison, as you requested," he said to Alberta, "and I've scheduled a meeting with Stanley Porter at the bank for this afternoon, if that suits you." "That would be perfect, thank you," Alberta replied. "The bank?" Edward's interest was piqued. "What business do you have with the bank?" Daniel looked at him with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his dislike. "Client confidentiality prevents me from discussing that, I'm afraid, but I'm sure Alberta will keep you informed of anything you need to know." As Daniel led Alberta to his car, she could feel 3 pairs of eyes boring into her back from the doorway of her own home. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked quietly once they were on the road. Alberta gazed out the window at the familiar neighborhood passing by. "No," she admitted, "but I will be." At the Madison Hotel, the manager himself came out to greet Alberta, which clearly surprised Daniel. "Mrs. Williams, how lovely to see you again," the manager said warmly. "We were so sorry to hear about Mr. Williams. He was a true gentleman." "Thank you, Thomas," Alberta replied. "I appreciate your kind words." "We've prepared the Riverside suite for you, as always," Thomas continued, gesturing to a staff member who immediately collected her modest suitcase. "And I've taken the liberty of arranging a small floral arrangement for the sitting room. Nothing too bold, just some white lilies I thought might bring a touch of peace." "That's very thoughtful," Alberta said. Daniel watched this exchange with growing curiosity as they were escorted not to a standard room, but to an elegant suite overlooking the river. The sitting room was tastefully appointed with antique furniture, fresh flowers, and a small handwritten note expressing condolences. Once they were alone, Daniel turned to Alberta with raised eyebrows. "As always?" Alberta smiled faintly as she removed her coat. "Richard and I stayed here every year on our anniversary. The staff knows me." "I see," Daniel said, though it was clear there was more to the story. "Alberta, before we meet with Stanley, I think we should discuss what happened at the house. Were they really suggesting you move to a retirement home the day of Richard's funeral?" Alberta's smile faded. "They've made their position quite clear. They see me as an inconvenience, a relic of their father's life that needs to be tidied away." She sat down on one of the elegant chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 64 years. "What they don't realize is that I've been managing inconvenient people my entire life." Daniel sat across from her. Richard left very specific instructions about the will reading. He wanted it done 1 week after the funeral, which is unusually quick. Richard was always efficient," Alberta said with a hint of fondness. "Yes, but I'm concerned about the timing now. Given their behavior, perhaps we should expedite matters even further." Alberta considered this, then shook her head. "No, Richard had his reasons for the timeline. Let's honor that. In the meantime, I need to speak with Stanley and get a few matters in order." Daniel hesitated. "Alberta, I feel I should warn you. Edward called me twice before the funeral asking about his father's assets. He seems to be under the impression that there's a substantial estate to be divided, and that as Richard's biological children, he and Marianne are entitled to the lion's share." "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing specific, client confidentiality, but he's persistent. And from what I observed today, they all seem to think you were financially dependent on Richard." Alberta's expression softened into something almost like pity. "Yes, they would think that." "The reality is quite different, isn't it?" Daniel asked carefully. Alberta stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river flowing steadily below. "Richard and I had an understanding from the very beginning. We kept some matters private, not secret, just private." She turned back to Daniel. "But I believe it's time for a fuller disclosure. Shall we go see Stanley?" The offices of Porter Financial Management occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek building in the financial district. As Alberta and Daniel stepped out of the elevator, they were greeted by a receptionist who immediately recognized Alberta. "Mrs. Williams, we weren't expecting you. Mr. Porter is in a meeting, but I'm sure he'll want to know you're here." "Please don't interrupt him," Alberta said. "We have an appointment for later this afternoon. We're a bit early." "Of course," the young woman replied, though she was already reaching for her phone. Within moments, Stanley Porter himself appeared in the reception area, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a bespoke suit. "Alberta," he said warmly, taking both her hands in his. "I was devastated to hear about Richard. Why didn't you call me directly?" "It's been a difficult time, Stanley," she replied, "but I'm here now." "Come through to my office," he insisted. "Daniel, good to see you as well." Stanley's corner office offered panoramic views of the city as they settled into the comfortable seating area rather than the more formal desk arrangement. Stanley's assistant appeared with a tea service. "Earl Grey, if I remember correctly," Stanley said to Alberta. She nodded, touched by the personal attention. "You have a good memory." "Richard would have my head if I forgot how his wife takes her tea," Stanley replied, then winced at his own wording. "I'm sorry, that was insensitive." "Not at all," Alberta assured him. "Richard would have said exactly that." Once they were settled with their tea, Stanley's expression grew more serious. "I assume this isn't merely a social call. What can I do for you, Alberta?" Alberta exchanged a glance with Daniel before responding. I need a complete overview of my financial position. All accounts, properties, investments, everything. Stanley nodded, unsurprised. I've prepared a preliminary report. After Richard called me last month, I anticipated you might need this information quickly. Richard called you? Daniel asked, clearly surprised. Stanley's expression softened. He knew the end was coming. He wanted to ensure everything was in order for Alberta. He reached for a tablet on the coffee table and pulled up a document which he passed to Alberta. This is the summary of your personal holdings, separate from Richard's estate. Alberta studied the figures on the screen, nodding occasionally. Daniel, unable to contain his professional curiosity, leaned slightly to glimpse the numbers. His eyebrows rose involuntarily. This is comprehensive, he commented carefully. Richard was nothing if not thorough, Stanley agreed. Alberta, as you can see, your position remains extremely strong. The properties in Manhattan have appreciated significantly, and the diversified portfolio we established has performed exceptionally well despite market fluctuations. And the Westlake building? Alberta asked. Still your crown jewel, Stanley confirmed. Fully leased with the renovations completed last year, already paying dividends in increased rental values. Daniel looked between them, confusion evident. I'm sorry, the Westlake building? The office complex downtown? Alberta nodded. Yes, that's the one. But that's a major commercial property, Daniel said. It must be worth $28 million at the last valuation, Stanley supplied. Though in today's market, probably closer to 30. Daniel set down his teacup carefully. I wasn't aware that you owned such significant assets, Alberta. A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. Few people are. Richard and I preferred it that way. Stanley cleared his throat. Alberta has been one of our most significant clients for over 20 years, Daniel. The Westlake building was actually her first major acquisition after selling her technology company. Technology company? Daniel repeated, feeling increasingly as though he'd stepped into an alternate reality. Williams Tech Solutions, Alberta supplied. I founded it in 1978, sold it in 1998. Richard was tremendously supportive throughout. He had a good eye for business opportunities. I see, Daniel said, though it was clear he was struggling to reconcile this information with the image of Alberta that Richard's children had painted. Stanley swiped through several more screens on the tablet. In total, your personal net worth stands at approximately $47 million, Alberta. That excludes any inheritances from Richard's estate, of course. Daniel nearly choked on his tea. And what about the house in Fairfield? Alberta asked, seemingly unaffected by the astronomical figure. Owned free and clear in your name, Stanley confirmed. Richard transferred the deed to you in 2009, if you recall, part of your 10th anniversary portfolio restructuring. Yes, I remember now, Alberta said. And Richard's business holdings? Here, Stanley's expression grew more complex. That's where things get interesting. On paper, Richard remained CEO and majority shareholder of Williams Enterprises. However, as you know, over the past decade, he systematically transferred most of the valuable assets to your name or to joint holdings, while maintaining the corporate shell for operational purposes. Why would he do that? Daniel asked, unable to contain himself. Alberta turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Richard had concerns about Edward's business acumen. He was particularly worried that Edward might try to take the company in a direction that would undermine its long-term stability. So he insulated the assets, Daniel concluded, professional admiration in his voice. Precisely, Stanley confirmed. The result is that Williams Enterprises, which Edward and Marianne presumably expect to inherit, is essentially a management company with limited assets of its own. The real value is in the holdings that Alberta already controls. Daniel sat back, processing this information. They have no idea, do they? No, Alberta said quietly. Richard and I agreed it was simpler that way. His children saw what they expected to see, a businessman and his homemaker wife. They never questioned it because it fit their preconceptions. But surely they must have wondered about your background, your education, Daniel pressed. Alberta shrugged lightly. They never asked. Cynthia once referred to me as Richard's trophy wife. I think she assumed I was a secretary, or perhaps a flight attendant who caught his eye. The fact that I was a widow with an engineering degree and a successful company never occurred to them. Stanley chuckled. If they'd bothered to Google you, they might have found your MIT alumni profile or the Forbes article from 1996. People see what they expect to see, Alberta repeated softly, echoing Richard's words from years ago. So what now? Daniel asked. Do you want me to expedite the will reading, make them aware of the situation? Alberta considered for a moment. No, let's proceed as Richard wanted. 1 week after the funeral. In the meantime, I'll stay at the Madison and allow them to believe they've successfully maneuvered me out of my own home. A strategic retreat, Stanley suggested with a knowing smile. Something like that, Alberta agreed. They've made their assumptions about me. I see no reason to correct them just yet. Back at the Fairfield house, Cynthia was directing the housekeeper with the confidence of someone who had lived there for years rather than hours. These drapes need to be replaced, she was saying, fingering the heavy silk curtains in the living room. They're completely outdated, and this furniture arrangement makes no sense for entertaining. The housekeeper, Mrs. Perez, who had worked for the Williams family for 15 years, maintained a carefully neutral expression. Mrs. Williams chose these curtains specifically for the way they filter the afternoon light, ma'am. She has migraines sometimes. Well, Mrs. Williams isn't here now, is she? Cynthia replied dismissively. And this is a family home. We need to make it functional for the family. In the study, Edward sat behind Richard's desk, going through drawers with increasing frustration. Marianne entered with 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to her brother. Any luck? She asked, taking a seat across from him. Edward closed a drawer with more force than necessary. Nothing. No financial statements. No property deeds, not even a checkbook. It's like he kept no records at all. That's odd, Marianne commented, sipping her drink. Dad was always so meticulous. Exactly, Edward agreed. Which means either he kept everything at the office or what? Edward's expression darkened. Or Alberta has already removed them. Marianne considered this. Do you really think she would do that? She seems so passive. That's what worries me, Edward said. She's been too accommodating, too calm about being pushed out of the house. Maybe she's just in shock, Marianne suggested. Or maybe she realizes this is for the best. I mean, what would she even do with this place? It's not like she has family of her own. Edward swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Did you know she's meeting with Pierce and someone from the bank today? No, Marianne said, sitting up straighter. How do you know that? I overheard Pierce mention it when they were leaving. Something about a meeting with Stanley Porter, the investment banker. Why would Alberta need to meet with him? Edward shrugged. Probably just formalities. Dad must have had accounts there. But why wouldn't Pierce just handle it himself? Marianne pressed. And why take Alberta along? Before Edward could respond, Cynthia entered the study, a triumphant expression on her face. You won't believe what I just found in the attic. She placed a dusty photo album on the desk. Family photos from before Alberta. There are pictures of your mother here that I've never seen. Edward and Marianne leaned forward with interest. Their mother, Richard's first wife, had died of cancer when they were young. Edward was 10, Marianne just 7. Richard had married Alberta 3 years later. Look at this one, Cynthia said, pointing to a photo of a young Richard with a beautiful woman on a beach. Your mother was stunning. I'd forgotten how young Dad was when they married, Marianne commented, studying the image. And successful, Edward added. He already had the company up and running by then. They flipped through more pages, family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday parties. Marianne's expression grew increasingly melancholy. We were happy, she said softly. Before she got sick, we were really happy. And then Dad replaced her with Alberta, Cynthia muttered. Cynthia, Edward warned, though there was little heat in his tone. Well, it's true, she insisted. 3 years after your mother died, he brings home this woman none of us knew, and suddenly she's your new mother. She never tried to be our mother, Marianne pointed out fairly. She always kept her distance. Exactly, Cynthia pounced, cold and calculating from the beginning. Wormed her way into your father's life and made sure to keep you two at arm's length. Edward closed the album thoughtfully. She did tend to disappear when we visited. Always had some errand or appointment. See, Cynthia said. And now she's off meeting with bankers on the day after the funeral. If that doesn't seem suspicious, I don't know what does. The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Edward went to answer it, returning moments later with a puzzled expression and a thick envelope. Courier delivery, he explained. From Pierce's office. It's an invitation to the reading of the will, scheduled for next Monday. So soon? Marianne asked. It's only been a day since the funeral. Apparently it was Dad's explicit instruction, Edward said, scanning the enclosed letter. Pierce says Dad was very specific about the timing. That's unusual, Cynthia commented. Usually these things take weeks to arrange. Not if it was pre-planned, Edward said slowly. Dad knew he was dying for months. He must have put everything in order before the end. Including the will, Marianne added, a note of anxiety creeping into her voice. Ed, what if he left everything to Alberta? Edward shook his head firmly. He wouldn't do that. We're his children, his blood. The company has been in the family for 2 generations. He wouldn't just hand it over to her. But they were married for almost 40 years, Marianne reminded him, and they never had children of their own. All the more reason the business should come to us, Edward insisted. Alberta has no connection to it, no understanding of how it works. Dad was a businessman first and foremost. He would never leave his life's work in the hands of someone who couldn't carry it forward. Cynthia was studying her husband's face carefully. You're worried, she observed. Edward took a long swallow of his scotch. I'm cautious. There's a lot at stake here. Williams Enterprises is worth millions. The house alone is probably valued at 4 or 5 million in this market. What about that retreat in Vermont? Marianne asked suddenly. And the apartment in the city. Those must be worth something too. Exactly, Edward said. Which is why we need to get a clearer picture of Dad's assets before this will reading. I think I'll pay a visit to the office tomorrow, see what I can find out. Good idea, Cynthia agreed. And Marianne and I can do some digging here. There must be records somewhere in this house. As they strategized, none of them noticed Mrs. Perez quietly closing the door to the study. She walked to the kitchen, took out her personal cell phone and dialed a number. Mrs. Williams? It's Elena Perez. I think you should know what's happening here. The Madison Hotel's Riverside Suite offered a tranquility that Alberta had desperately needed. As she sat on the balcony overlooking the water, she allowed herself a moment to truly feel the loss of Richard. Not just as a husband, but as a partner, a confidant, and the one person who had truly understood her. Their marriage had been unconventional in many ways. Both widowed, both successful in their own rights, they had found in each other not just love, but mutual respect. Richard had never felt threatened by her business acumen or her wealth. Instead, he had delighted in it, often joking that he'd married up. The phone call from Eleanor had not surprised her. She had expected Edward and Cynthia to start searching for financial information. What did surprise her was the discovery of the old photo album. They were looking at pictures of his first wife, Elena had reported. The blonde lady. They seemed sad. Alberta had never felt jealous of Catherine, Richard's first wife. How could she? The woman had given him 2 children and years of happiness before cancer took her, just as it had taken Alberta's first husband, James. If anything, Alberta felt a kinship with Catherine, 2 women who had loved the same good man. What hurt was the realization that in 38 years, Edward and Marianne had never tried to know her. They had cast her as the interloper, the replacement, and had never bothered to look deeper. A knock at the suite door interrupted her thoughts. It was Daniel, returning from his office with a folder of documents. "Everything's in order for Monday," he reported, setting the folder on the coffee table. "I've prepared all the necessary paperwork as Richard instructed." "Thank you, Daniel," Alberta said, returning to the sitting room. "I appreciate your efficiency." Daniel hesitated, then sat down across from her. "Alberta, I feel I should apologize." She looked at him quizzically. "Whatever for?" "For underestimating you," he admitted. "I've been Richard's attorney for 15 years, and I never realized the full extent of your situation." Alberta smiled gently. "There's no need to apologize. Richard and I compartmentalized our lives deliberately. He handled the public face of the business, while I managed our investments and properties more discreetly." "But why?" Daniel pressed. "Why maintain the fiction that you were just a housewife?" Alberta considered the question carefully. "It wasn't exactly a fiction. I was a wife who loved her home and her husband. But as for the rest..." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "When I sold my company in the late 90s, it was for a considerable sum. I was only 37 and suddenly very wealthy. Richard was already established with his own business and reputation." She rose and walked to the window before continuing. "We discussed it at length. If we combined our assets publicly, it would change the dynamics of everything. His relationship with his children, his standing in the business community, even our social circle. People treat you differently when they know you have money, especially women. So you kept your wealth separate and private," Daniel concluded. "We kept our financial arrangements private," Alberta corrected. "But we were partners in every sense. Richard consulted me on all major business decisions, and I did the same with him. We simply found it more effective for the world to see what it expected to see." "A successful businessman and his supportive wife," Daniel said with new understanding. "Exactly. It simplified things. Richard could maintain his relationships without the complications that might arise if everyone knew his wife was independently wealthy, and I could make investment decisions based on merit rather than obligation." "And his children never knew?" Alberta's expression saddened. "They never asked. From the beginning, they saw me as an outsider. I tried in those early years, but they were grieving their mother, and I represented a change they weren't ready for. By the time they were adults, the pattern was set." Daniel shook his head in amazement. "So for all these years, they've assumed you were financially dependent on Richard, while in reality, much of what they think of as Dad's money has actually been mine for quite some time," Alberta finished. "The house has been in my name for over a decade, the Vermont property as well, even the apartment in the city which I purchased before I met Richard." "And they have no idea," Daniel marveled. "No. Richard wanted to tell them many times, but I felt it would only complicate matters. Why upset the status quo when it was working for everyone?" "But it's not working anymore," Daniel pointed out gently. "They're trying to push you out of your own home." Alberta's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, and that changes things considerably." Another knock at the door announced room service, a light dinner that Alberta had ordered earlier. "Will you join me?" she asked Daniel as the waiter set up the meal on the small dining table. "I should get back to the office," he declined politely. "But before I go, there's one more thing we should discuss. Edward called me twice today." Alberta raised an eyebrow as she took a seat at the table. "Oh, he's asking about Richard's assets, trying to get a clearer picture before Monday. I maintained client confidentiality, of course, but he's becoming insistent. He mentioned something about suspicious banking activities that he claims you might be involved in." Alberta's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Suspicious activities." "Apparently he visited Richard's office today and found some discrepancies in the company records, transfers to accounts he doesn't recognize. He's jumping to conclusions. He's discovering the asset transfers," Alberta realized. The ones Richard made years ago. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He thinks these are recent moves, possibly made while Richard was ill. He's suggesting, without saying it outright, that you might have taken advantage of Richard's condition to divert funds. Alberta set down her fork. Her appetite suddenly diminished. I see. I wanted you to be prepared. The tone of the conversation was concerning. Edward seems determined to challenge whatever provisions Richard made for you, based on the assumption that I don't deserve it, Alberta said softly. I'm afraid so, Daniel confirmed. Alberta, I have to ask, are you sure you want to wait until Monday? I could arrange a private meeting, explain the situation to them beforehand. It might be less confrontational. Alberta considered this, then shook her head. No, Richard wanted it this way, and I respect his wishes. Besides, she added with a hint of steel in her voice, perhaps it's time for them to face the consequences of their assumptions. After Daniel left, Alberta found herself unable to eat. Instead, she returned to the balcony, watching as the lights of the city began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Her phone rang, the caller ID showing Elena Perez once again. Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry to bother you again, Elena said, her voice hushed. But they're going through everything now. Mr. Edward found the safe in the master closet and is trying to open it. Thank you for letting me know, Elena, Alberta replied calmly. But there's no need to worry. There's nothing in that safe except some old jewelry and our passports. They're talking about changing the locks, Eleanor continued anxiously. Mrs. Cynthia said it would be for your own protection because you might be confused or forgetful. Alberta's hand tightened on the phone. I see. I told them I would not work in a house where the rightful owner was locked out, Elena said, a note of pride in her voice. Mr. Edward said that was fine. They would find someone else. Elena, you've been with us for 15 years, Alberta said, concerned. I don't want you to lose your position over this. I would not work for them anyway, Elena replied firmly. Mr. Richard and you have always treated me with respect. They treat me like I am invisible, except when they want something. Thank you, Elena, Alberta said, genuinely moved. Your loyalty means a great deal to me. Don't worry about your job. Whatever happens, I'll make sure you're taken care of. After ending the call, Alberta sat in thoughtful silence. The situation was escalating more quickly than she had anticipated. Edward wasn't just making assumptions. He was actively working to exclude her from what he perceived as his inheritance. The fact that he would consider changing the locks on her own home, a home she had owned outright for years, was beyond presumptuous. It was hostile. For the first time since Richard's death, Alberta felt a genuine anger rising within her, not just at the disrespect shown to her, but at the disrespect shown to Richard's memory. They hadn't even waited a week before trying to dismantle the life she and Richard had built together. She picked up her phone again and dialed Stanley Porter. Stanley, it's Alberta. I think we need to accelerate our timeline. How quickly can you freeze access to all the Williams Enterprises accounts? Monday morning dawned clear and bright, inappropriately cheerful weather for what Alberta knew would be a difficult day. She dressed carefully in a tailored navy suit that Richard had always admired, pearls at her throat and ears. Her silver hair was styled impeccably, her makeup subtle but flawless. Looking in the mirror, she saw not a grieving widow, but the CEO who had once graced the cover of Business Weekly. Ready for battle, she murmured to herself, a phrase Richard had often used before important meetings. Daniel met her in the hotel lobby, his expression revealing his own tension. The others are already at the office, he reported. Edward arrived with the family attorney in tow. Family attorney? Alberta questioned. Garrison Reed, corporate lawyer, specializes in contested wills and estates. Alberta sighed. So they're prepared to challenge the will before they've even heard it. It would appear so, Daniel confirmed. Are you sure you want to go through with this? It could get ugly. Alberta squared her shoulders. Richard faced far worse in building his company. I can certainly face this. The law offices of Pierce and Associates occupied a dignified brownstone in the heart of the city's legal district. As Daniel escorted Alberta into the conference room, three faces turned toward them, none particularly welcoming. Edward sat at the far end of the table, as if claiming the head position. Beside him was Cynthia, dressed in what appeared to be new designer morning attire. Marianne sat across from them, looking uncomfortable but resolute. A fourth person, a hawk-faced man in an expensive suit, sat beside Edward, presumably Garrison Reed. "Good morning," Alberta said pleasantly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from Edward. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Ooh, we've been here for 20 minutes, Cynthia replied tartly. "The appointment was for 10 o'clock, Daniel pointed out, checking his watch. "It's currently 9:55. Before Cynthia could respond, the door opened again, and Stanley Porter entered, followed by a court reporter and a young woman carrying a video camera and tripod. "What's this?" Edward demanded, half rising from his seat. "Who are these people?" "Stanley Porter, Alberta's financial advisor," Stanley introduced himself smoothly. "The will reading is to be recorded, as per Richard Williams' explicit instructions. The court reporter will provide an official transcript, and Ms. Keller will handle the video documentation." "This is highly irregular," Reed interjected, speaking for the first time. "Mr. Pierce, I must object to these proceedings." "Your objection is noted," Daniel replied calmly, "but ultimately irrelevant. Richard Williams left very specific instructions about how his will was to be executed, including the requirement for video and transcript records. As the executor of his estate, I am bound to follow those instructions." Reed leaned over to whisper something to Edward, who frowned but nodded reluctantly. Once the recording equipment was set up and the court reporter ready, Daniel took his position at the center of the table. He removed a sealed envelope from his briefcase, displaying it to everyone present. "This is the last will and testament of Richard James Williams, dated March 15th of this year, witnessed and notarized according to state law. Before I read the contents, I'm required to play this video message that Richard recorded to accompany the will." Edward and Marianne exchanged surprised glances as Daniel set up a laptop and turned it to face the table. The screen flickered to life, showing Richard seated in his study at home. Though clearly ill, his eyes were bright and his voice steady. "If you're watching this," Richard began, "then I've lost my battle with cancer. I hope my funeral wasn't too dreary. I always hated long services." Alberta smiled faintly at this characteristic touch of humor. "I've asked Daniel to gather you all together quickly because I know how anxious you must be about the future. Edward, Marianne, I know you're concerned about the company and your inheritance. Alberta, my love, I know you're worried about how you'll be treated once I'm gone." Richard paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "I've had a lot of time to think these past few months about my life, my accomplishments, and most importantly, the people I love. I've made mistakes, plenty of them. Perhaps my greatest mistake was allowing misunderstandings to persist when I should have insisted on clarity." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze seeming to penetrate through the screen directly to his children. "Edward, Marianne, you never really knew Alberta. That's partly my fault. I allowed you to maintain your distance, to see only what you wanted to see. I told myself it was easier that way, that forcing relationships rarely works. But in doing so, I denied you the opportunity to know one of the most remarkable women I've ever met." Cynthia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Edward maintained a stony expression. "Before I met Alberta, I was a moderately successful businessman with a growing company and 2 wonderful children. What most of you don't know is that Alberta was already a millionaire when we met. She had built and sold a technology company that pioneered software still used in hospitals today. She was brilliant, independent, and could have had any man she wanted. For some reason, she chose me." Alberta felt tears welling in her eyes at the memory of their early days together. "Over the years, we built a partnership that went far beyond marriage. Alberta's business acumen and investment strategies multiplied my initial success many times over. While I was the public face of Williams Enterprises, Alberta was often the brain behind our most successful ventures. The Westlake acquisition that transformed our company. Alberta spotted that opportunity and structured the deal. The expansion into Asian markets. Alberta's idea based on research she'd conducted independently. Edward's face had gone pale while Marianne looked simply confused. I'm telling you this now because I know what assumptions you've made. You see Alberta as my dependent, someone who needs to be taken care of now that I'm gone. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality, which you would have discovered if you'd ever bothered to ask, is that Alberta has been independently wealthy for our entire marriage. Richard smiled then, a hint of mischief in his expression. In fact, for the past 12 years, I've been gradually transferring most of my assets into Alberta's name, not out of any concern about inheritance taxes or legal complications, but simply because it made sense. The house in Fairfield? Alberta has owned it outright since 2009. The Vermont property? Hers since 2011. Even the majority of Williams Enterprises' valuable assets have been moved into holding companies that Alberta controls. Edward made a choked sound, while Reed began furiously scribbling notes. I did this with full transparency to our financial and legal advisors, Richard continued, anticipating the reaction. Every transfer was properly documented and executed while I was in excellent health. There can be no question of coercion or manipulation. He paused again, his expression growing softer. Now, as to my remaining assets and the formal structure of Williams Enterprises, I've made provisions that I believe are fair to everyone. Daniel will read those details to you. But before he does, I want to say one last thing. Richard looked directly into the camera, his gaze uncommonly intense. Life is too short for misunderstandings and assumptions. I love all of you, each in my own way. I hope that after I'm gone, you might find a way to truly know each other, rather than continuing to see only what you expect to see. The screen went dark, leaving a profound silence in the conference room. Daniel cleared his throat and broke the seal on the envelope. Now to the formal will. The reading itself was almost anticlimactic after Richard's video. The will was clear and straightforward. Edward and Marianne would each receive a cash bequest of $50,000, plus Richard's personal effects to be divided equally between them. The operational control of Williams Enterprises, what remained of it after the asset transfers, would go to Edward, with the stipulation that he retain the current management team for at least 2 years. Everything else, all remaining property, investments, accounts, and assets, was left to Alberta. When Daniel finished reading, Edward slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. The company is worth millions. $50,000 is insulting. Reed placed a restraining hand on Edward's arm. We'll be contesting this will, he announced formally. There are clear signs of undue influence and possibly fraud. The supposed asset transfers will need to be thoroughly investigated. Stanley Porter spoke up for the first time. I brought complete documentation of all transfers made over the past 15 years, he said mildly, pushing a thick folder across the table. Each one properly executed, witnessed, and filed. You're welcome to review them, but I can assure you they'll withstand any scrutiny. This isn't right, Marianne said, her voice trembling. Dad built that company from nothing. It's our family legacy. And you never contributed anything, Cynthia added, glaring at Alberta. You just sat in that house while Richard did all the work. A strange calm settled over Alberta as she finally met Cynthia's hostile gaze. Is that what you think? That I never contributed? We know it, Edward snapped. Dad may have been blinded by whatever hold you had on him, but we know the truth. You've been living off him for 40 years. Alberta smiled then, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't contribute to Richard's success because his success was, in many ways, mine. As Richard mentioned, I owned a successful technology company before we met. I sold it for $18 million in 1998, about $300 million in today's money. She opened her handbag and removed a small leather portfolio, the one she'd retrieved from under the mattress days earlier. From it, she extracted several documents, which she laid carefully on the table. This is the deed to the house in Fairfield, which I've owned outright since 2009. This is the title to the Vermont property. And this, she said, placing a final document before them, is the ownership certificate for the Westlake building, the $28 million office complex that houses, among other tenants, the headquarters of Williams Enterprises. She looked directly at Edward. Your father's company has been paying rent to me for the past 11 years. That's why you found those suspicious transfers in the company records. They weren't going to secret accounts. They were legitimate rental payments to WLB Holdings, which is my company. The silence that followed was absolute. Edward stared at the documents as if they might burst into flames. Marianne looked simply stunned. Cynthia's face had drained of all color. My personal net worth, Alberta continued calmly, is approximately $47 million. That excludes anything I might inherit from Richard's estate, which appears to be relatively modest in comparison. I never needed Richard's money. I had my own. She gathered the documents and returned them to her portfolio. So you see, the uncomfortable truth is that the family home you're so eager to claim, the one you were planning to change the locks on to keep me out, it's mine. It has been for years. You've been living in my house, making plans for my property, all while treating me like an inconvenient widow who needs to be shipped off to a retirement home. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again, seemingly unable to form words. I think, Daniel interjected gently, that this concludes our formal business for today. The will has been read, and Richard's wishes made clear. Mr. Reed, if you wish to contest the will, that is your right. But I would strongly advise reviewing the documentation Mr. Porter has provided before proceeding. As the court reporter and videographer packed up their equipment, Alberta rose from her seat with quiet dignity. I'll be returning to my home this afternoon, she announced. I'd appreciate it if you could have your belongings removed by 3 o'clock. You're throwing us out? Marianne asked incredulously. Alberta regarded her with a mixture of pity and resolve. Just as you planned to do to me, the difference is it's actually my house. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Richard was right about one thing. Life is too short for misunderstandings. If at some point you're interested in getting to know the woman your father actually married, rather than the caricature you created, I would welcome that conversation. My door will be open. With that, she left the conference room, her head high and her steps steady. Behind her, she could hear the beginning of heated whispers and recriminations, but she didn't look back. Richard had always told her that in business, the most powerful exit was a quiet one. Outside, the spring sun was warm on her face. For the first time since Richard's diagnosis, Alberta felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy. Grief never was, but she would face it on her own terms, in her own home, with the dignity Richard had always admired in her. Ready to go home? Daniel asked, joining her on the sidewalk. Alberta nodded, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. Yes, I think it's time. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and unexpected justice, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring more captivating narratives like Alberta's to life. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.